Okay, guys. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you let me know in the chat? Okay. So before we get into today's lesson, I just wanted to say that if you guys have any ideas or how I can teach better, if I'm not teaching okay, then please fill out the feedback form that's on the classroom post. And if you guys are struggling with any concepts, you guys can feel free to email me. That's also on Classroom. And make sure you guys watch the videos and the resources that I'm putting there because those are going to help you guys understand the concepts. So with that out of the way, let's get into the lesson. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue where we left off, and then we're probably going to go into the characteristics of life. So uh, the study of living things is biology, how they work, how they interact with the environment, how they change over time. There's many different fields in biology, like medicine, nutrition, genetics, physiology, microbiology, ecology. These are just a few. So now living versus non-living. So abiotic means non-living, and biotic means living. So abiotic factors are things like rocks, sunlight. One second. Okay, so abiotic things are mostly living things, or non-living things, so like rocks and sunlight and things like that. Biotic factors are things that are living, so humans, things in the environment. Dead matter is considered a biotic thing. A few of you guys were asking about that last class. We consider dead things biotic because they are a living factor. So living and dead in our case are both biotic, just to clear that up. Uh, so energy is a big deal in biology. So because living things have to obtain nutrients and energy, and we need to do this to, run our cells, to think, to move. All of these things require energy. So the stuff that we eat gets transferred into energy for, us to move and things like that. So next class, we're actually going to go into chemistry and start doing the basics of chemistry. And basis of chemistry is matter, anything that has mass or takes up space. And mass is just made up of tiny particles called atoms. This is the tiniest unit of matter. And the other part of us is energy. And energy is what is used to do work. It's not matter. However, we can get it from matter and from the bonds in matter. So the main elements that actually make up life are chnops, or carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These are the major ones. And the reason for these elements is, we'll get into that later when we start doing biochemistry, but it's good to remember these, and a great way to remember that is using chnops, which is the acronym. So these atoms are not just in, humans and living things. They also are in a bunch of other, different, I guess, abiotic factors, like from stars, like the sun contains these elements, rocks contain these elements, the soil contains these elements. It's just that in humans, these are the major ones that, make us up. So when comparing, the Earth's crust to the human body, the major elements in humans are, as I said, oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Those are the major ones that you guys have to remember. And the reason why oxygen and hydrogen are so big is because they're actually in water, and 70% of us is water. So that's why oxygen and hydrogen are so big. Now, carbon is also a really big atom because carbon is considered the basic building block for life. So whenever you see something or a molecule that has carbon, it's considered organic because of the fact that it's the basic building block for life. Also, you guys want to take notes. If you really want to take notes, I recommend going to the lecture that's going to be posted after on Classroom. It's a recording of the video because I'm going to go a little bit quicker because some people thought that last class was too easy. So just go back to the recording if you're finding anything difficult and just review there. Okay, let's keep going then. So the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen, oxygen, and other gases. So 79% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. And while this may seem weird, like, because we're breathing in the atmosphere pretty much, this nitrogen is in a form that's not usable because it's really tightly bound. It's called N2. So because it's so tightly bound, our body can't use it in any way. So we just breathe it out. It doesn't get absorbed into the blood or anything like that. And the other gases, argon, carbon dioxide, and methane, they're pretty much 0%. So, I mean, you don't really have to worry about those. So, as I said, these atoms are not just in humans, they, recycle throughout the atmosphere. So the example shown here is the carbon cycle, and then down here is the oxygen cycle. So the carbon cycle involves, the atmosphere CO2 being transferred into what they call stores, which is like dead matter or coal, oil, and gas, or marine deposits, or even rocks. It gets put into these reservoirs, and then we pick it out again when we burn fossil fuels. So when we're burning fossil fuels, we're actually burning dead plant or animal matter, which contains carbon. And this puts the carbon back into the atmosphere, which then gets decomposited into the ground and these reservoirs, and that cycle just keeps going. Then what happens is in the oxygen cycle, what you have is a very similar thing where the atmosphere is putting oxygen into animals, into plants, and then those plants will release that oxygen back into the atmosphere. It's also involved with cars and rocks. These can also uptake oxygen and release it back. And these two cycles are actually connected because when animals like us, we take in oxygen to do cellular respiration and make energy, and we actually end up releasing carbon dioxide. In the carbon cycle, the plants will take up the carbon dioxide and will release oxygen. And so because of that, the oxygen and the carbon dioxide are constantly being cycled between plants and animals, which relates the carbon and oxygen cycles. So the cycle shown here is the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is quite interesting because as I said, the nitrogen in the atmosphere can't actually be used by plants. So for example, the nitrogen fixing bacteria are the ones that have to break apart this nitrogen. So in the soil, these can be found in the soil, and they can also be found in root nodules of the plants or legumes. And then once this nitrogen is fixed or just broken down by these bacteria, it can be taken up by plants, and then this nitrogen in plants can be taken in by us after we eat the plants. So as you can see, a lot of organisms work together to survive, and also how nitrogen is constantly being cycled throughout the environment. So this cycle is the water cycle, which I'm guessing many of you already know. So I just wanted to talk about how the water cycle can actually relate to ions and metals like phosphorus and sulfur, how they're involved with the water cycle. Because when it rains, what can happen is a lot of rocks can get eroded and weathered, and this will transfer these these metals into the water. And then from the water, they can sediment in the bottom of the lake or river or ocean and create new rocks. Then from there, they can get deposited onto land and create new rocks there. And then after that, they're going to get eroded again by water. So the water cycle helps to transport rocks around and around from land into rivers and things like that. So that's why the water cycle is also really important to biology. So water is a really important factor for life, and it's also recycled constantly. So the reason why water is so essential to life is because it's involved with all chemical reactions. Any chemical reaction that takes place in your body needs water to occur. So this is why we're made up of 70% of water, because it's really important. We're also going to get into other properties of water in later classes that show that it's just a really essential molecule. So just to review, the elements that are really important for humans are chnops, where N is nitrogen, C is carbon, H is hydrogen, O is oxygen, P is phosphorus, and S is sulfur. And I don't know if I can share the PowerPoints to you guys on Google Classroom, but I will post the recordings, and those will include the entire PowerPoints. So you can just see it. Okay, so other important abiotic factors are soil. And the reason why soil is so important is because it contains a lot of nutrients. So the topsoil, or the top layer of soil, is very filled with nutrients because it contains a lot of decomposed and dead living things. And these living things contain things like carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, or chnops, which we know are essential to life. And so this is also mixed with very small rock particles, which is why we consider it abiotic. See, this is one of the things where it's like, is it abiotic or not? But we do consider it abiotic because it actually contains very small rock particles, more so than these decomposed living things. So that's why we consider it abiotic. So now the other thing is going to be rock and just the earth. So geology is really essential to the formation and the structure of our planet. Even the rock cycle is really important. And this is a pretty hard question, but can anyone give me any ideas on how the rock cycle could relate to biology? All right, so it seems like this is a little difficult question, and it definitely is. So the thing about the rock cycle is that it is the movement of rocks, throughout the world, right? So, rocks can transport because of weathering and erosion, which relates it to the water cycle, and it can also transport due to air. And so because of this, the rock cycle is really involved with transporting nutrients like different metals, like phosphorus is contained in rocks, sulfur is in rocks, calcium is in rocks. All of these things are in rocks. So plants will actually use these rocks to uptake nutrients because they have these nutrients attached to them. So with the rock cycle, that's the cycling of rocks around the planet, obviously. So that means that when you cycle these rocks, you're exposing a lot of plants to all of these nutrients. That's why it's really important. So in other words, the same types of atoms can be combined differently to make both living and non-living things. So for example, we saw that in rocks, we have phosphorus, sulfur, nitrogen, all of these things are contained in rocks. And similarly, in humans, we have these elements. So you have to understand that in chemistry, the way atoms are combined makes these molecules have different properties. So, for example, in living things, phosphorus might be used to make up DNA, but in non-living things, it might be used in the rock to make up a crystal structure. So that's really important to biology, that, living and non-living things have the same elements, but are just combined in different ways. So now we're going to get into life. What is life? That is the essential question that biology tries to answer. So we're going to look at some things that are common in life in this presentation here. So we're just going to talk about what does it mean to be alive and the common characteristics all living things have. So all living things share some basic properties. They all have cellular organization. And cellular organization is really important because cells, make up our body and what our body is made of. They're the basic unit of us. Reproduction. Reproduction is important because it gives rise to new life, and that keeps species going. Metabolism is really important. Metabolism is the use of energy. Energy, as we said, is really important because it allows us to do all of the things we can do, need to do. Homeostasis. Homeostasis is just the balance of our body. So, for example, our body temperature. We can't let our body temperature go too high because otherwise we'll get hyperthermia and have a fever. And if we let our body temperature go too low, then we're going to become really cold and we're going to get hypothermia. And even a change in like 5 degrees of your body temperature can lead to death. So that's why homeostasis is really important, and all living things will have that to stay alive. Heredity, or DNA. Heredity is, what parents will pass on to their offspring. So, for example, your mother and father had their DNA, and that makes up who you are. So for that reason, heredity is really important because it makes you who you are and allows, the species to pass on traits from one another. Now, there's also responsiveness to their environment. So this means that organisms will respond to environmental cues, whether it be other organisms, sunlight, or things like that. So if a lion, it sees a gazelle, it will respond to that by, chasing after the gazelle or stalking the gazelle. And this is an example of responding, or of the lion responding to its environment. And so, this is probably a really natural example, but there's other examples with us. If we're thirsty, that's an environmental cue, and then we'll go to the kitchen to get water. So that's a key characteristic of life too. Then there's growth and development. So growth and development is important because it's, as we grow, we change over time. And this is really important for our development and the development of the species. And all organisms will do this. And then finally, they all adapt through evolution. This means that, they acquire new characteristics. So before we go into this, so to answer some questions, so if our body temperatures get to, I believe at 93 degrees, we'll get hypothermia and we'll also get organ failure at that temperature. And any temperature pretty much above 104 is very bad and can lead to a lot of, again, organ damage. And, you can die from things like that. And so, responding to your environment is not exactly like instincts. Instincts are more like innate things that we're born with, while so things like I don't know, maybe just looking, right? If you just look at something, then and you if you're in the dark or you wake up in the morning and you see that there's a giant flash of light outside your room, then you're automatically going to go and you're going to open your blinds. While this might not be maybe instinct, it's just you're responding to your environment. So whatever you look, you touch, you see, you smell, and you do something based off of that stimulus, that's a response to your environment. So the difference between organic phosphate and inorganic phosphate. So phosphate is actually a compound. It's made up of phosphorus and oxygen molecules. So organic phosphate is combined with carbon. Remember I said how carbon is really important and that's the basic building block of life. So in DNA, for example, that's an organic molecule with organic phosphate because it contains carbon. The phosphate molecule will bind to carbon. In inorganic phosphate, what you're going to have is you're just going to have the phosphate molecule maybe bind to itself, or maybe it's going to be bind to a hydrogen or something like that. So that's the difference. Organic always means it has carbon, and inorganic means it probably doesn't. Okay. So continuing on, we're going to start with cells. So cells are the smallest unit of life capable of all functions. So this is because, we know that there's some organisms that are unicellular. For example, bacteria. Bacteria are unicellular organisms. They just contain one cell, but they're still able to survive and live. Um, but there's also multicellular organisms. There's also multicellular organisms. So we are an example of multicellular organisms, and that's because we contain many different types of cells, and we're made up of many, many cells. And so these cells in us have specialized functions. So for example, your nerve cells will communicate to your brain. Your liver cells will help you to digest food. So the cells in us have specialized functions, while the cells in unicellular organisms, it's just one cell doing all the work for the organism. So this here is an example of a fern. A fern is also a multicellular organism. And these are plant cells. These plant cells will make up that fern. And then that's the anatomy of a plant cell, which we will get to later. So in addition, all living things will reproduce. Okay. So reproduction is the process of a species producing new individuals in the population. So this is a really important concept because reproduction is what keeps species alive and what keeps populations alive. So there's two different types of reproduction. There's asexual and sexual. So asexual reproduction is just when one organism reproduces by itself. An example of this is in bacteria. So what bacteria will do is you'll have like a whole bacteria, and the bacteria will literally just split down the middle, and it'll create two new organisms. It's called binary fission, and it's seen in, it's an example of asexual reproduction in bacteria. And it's just one parent producing more offspring. The other type is sexual reproduction. So in sexual reproduction, you have two different parents contribute genetic information, and you have to have the combination of male and female sex cells, and this will create a new organism. And so the most important thing about sexual reproduction is that it creates genetic variation. What this means is that, all of the offspring of two parents are not going to be exactly the same. For example, if any of you guys have any siblings or even twins, you guys are not exactly the same. And that's what's so great about sexual reproduction, is that it creates new organisms that are not exactly the same as their parent organisms. Asexual reproduction, on the other hand, just produces two identical copies of the parent. So it'll produce two offspring that are exactly the same. And while this may seem dumb, like why would you do that? It's actually quite important too for those bacteria who are so small, because their life cycle is so short that it's better to just reproduce really quickly, because sexual reproduction can take a long time, while asexual reproduction is very quick. The life cycle is very quick. That's the benefit of asexual reproduction, is that it's really quick. So the other thing is that all living things will obtain and use energy. So living things pretty much need energy to do anything, to grow, develop, repair, reproduce. All of these other functions, or all of these other characteristics of life require energy. So there's three different types of the way we can use energy. So the first is anabolism. Anabolism is the building up of complex substances from simpler substances. So an example of this is photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is where we take carbon dioxide and water, and we build that up into sugars. And then also you can build up cells and other cellular components. So the other example is catabolism, which is the breaking down of complex substances into simpler substances to release energy. So in the chat, can you guys tell me any examples that you guys know of catabolism? Okay, so it seems like a lot of you guys got it. And yeah, so the two prime examples are digestion and cellular respiration. So in digestion, you're taking the food that you eat and you're breaking it down into smaller sugars and smaller proteins. And once you break this down, you can release energy from that. The other one is cell respiration, which is taking glucose and pretty much just breaking it down. So yeah. So then the final type is metabolism. So metabolism is the combination of anabolism and catabolism, which is, so pretty much involves breaking something down and then building it up to create like a new product. So it's kind of like the total of all chemical reactions in an organism. So whenever an organism uses energy, it is considered metabolism. So when you're doing cell respiration, that's a metabolic reaction. When you're doing photosynthesis, it's also a metabolic reaction. Even though one is building something up and one is breaking something down, they're still metabolic reactions because they use energy. So in that sense, anabolism plus catabolism is equal to metabolism. So this is an example of, a polysaccharide, which is just a large sugar. It's broken down by catabolism. But then, on the left with the green arrows, you can also see that it's being built up. All of those little pieces will come together to form that large polysaccharide. So if we look at the entire thing, this entire picture, that's an example of metabolism. But if we look at the left, that's just anabolism. And if we look at the right, that's just catabolism. Does everybody understand? If you do, just say yes in this chat. Okay, good. For those of you who said sort of, I will post another resource on Classroom so that you guys can see this like in a little bit more detailed explanation. That'll help you guys out. Okay. So all organisms have to maintain homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is a stable state of conditions in the body that's necessary for life. So some example of this is body temperature. As I said, you have to maintain that stable body temperature, otherwise you can die or you can be at risk for dying. Blood volume. So with blood volume, if you have too much blood volume, you get things like high blood pressure, and this can cause swelling in your joints, which can be really painful. And if you have a really low blood volume, then you're not going to be able to get oxygen to the rest of your body parts, and you could be fatigued, and you could die from this too. So homeostasis is really important in that sense. So pH balance. So what pH is it's a measure of acidity. So for example, some things are really, really acidic. For example, lemon juice. Lemon juice is something that is really, really acidic. So if your body had the same pH as lemon juice, you would not be able to survive. And then on the opposite end of the scale, there's something called alkalinity, or how basic something is. There's two ends of a pH scale. There's the acidity, and the alkalinity. So if something is really acidic, it can like burn you from the insides. And if something is really alkaline, it'll break down a lot of molecules in you. So this is why it's really important to maintain a pH balance, because otherwise, you could die very quickly. Water balance. Water balance is also really important. As I said, water is really key to life. It makes up 70% of us. So even if we lose like 20% of our water, we could be, in extreme dehydration, and that's really life-threatening to us. So our body tries to maintain all of these things at a certain level. So for example, for body temperature, if our temperature is getting too high, then our body temperature will take measures to cool us down. If our blood volume is getting too low, then our cells may take some of their fluid and put it into the blood so that, the blood volume increases, because we don't want, our blood volume to be too low or high, or our temperature to be too low or high. So the next thing is heredity. So heredity is based off of DNA, and all organisms will pass on their traits. So chromosomes will contain genes that carry hereditary information. So what this means is that, your genes are things that code for traits. So for example, your eye color is coded for by a certain gene in your DNA. So what happens is your parents will pass on their genes to you. So that's why, people with brown eyes, often their offspring or their children will also have brown eyes because those genes are being passed along from the parent to the offspring. Now, the things that contain these genes are called chromosomes. Chromosomes are giant bundles of DNA. And so that's why these chromosomes are really important, because they contain the DNA. Yeah, as I said, genes are composed of DNA, and that DNA is carried in the chromosomes. So heredity is the reason children resemble their parents. As I said, your DNA, or the parent's DNA, is passed on to the offspring. So that means that the parent's traits are also passed on to the offspring. So that's why families will look very similar because of this principle. And the next thing is that mutations. Mutations change the DNA code and can be passed from generation to generation. So for example, sometimes when parents have, two brown-eyed parents, most likely they will produce a child with brown eyes because, their DNA contains those genes, and those genes will be passed on to the children. And so the children will have those genes that code for brown eyes. However, sometimes you can have a mutation in the DNA. And what this does is it changes it. So for example, maybe that brown-eyed parent gives their DNA to their offspring, but then that DNA gets mutation. What happens then is, maybe the offspring will have blue eyes. And so this is why mutations can be really important, and they can change the DNA code. Does everybody understand that? The mutations part, heredity, and homeostasis? Okay. Alleles, we will get into later when we go to genetics, but think of alleles as subsets of genes. So for example, alleles could be brown-eyed, black-eyed, blue-eyed. They're all the different variations of the genes. The genes are like the general class, and then the alleles are kind of like the subclass. And this class is going to be a little bit longer than 30 minutes, most likely. I mean, it already is. So yeah, you guys may have to log off in a few minutes, because if we don't finish in time, we have around 4 more slides to do. So next is living things responding to their environment. So organisms react to stimuli. Stimuli are things that stimulate us. So for example, if you touch the chair you're on, that's a stimulus. And organisms react to that. So for example, light. When we look at something, or when we look at the sun, we instantly, cover our eyes because the sun is very bright. So that the stimulus here would be the sun shining in our eyes. And our reaction would be to look away, or to close our eyes, or to cover our eyes. There's also, temperature. So, when it's too hot or it's too cold, you'll change the clothes you wear, or you may even, put on a heater, put on the AC. So we react in different ways to different changes in temperature. Also, odor, smells. If you smell something great coming from the kitchen, then you might go to the kitchen and check what it is. Again, the stimulus is the smell coming from the kitchen, and the reaction is us going to the kitchen to check. So then there's also sound. So sound is really important because, when we listen to things, it's really helpful in nature to hear predators or prey or things like that. So, when we get a stimulus, again, we'll react to that in the appropriate way. Gravity can even be a stimulus. On a roller coaster, when, you're riding upside down and things like that, your reaction might be to throw up because, because gravity is influencing you when you're upside down and making you nauseous. and your reaction is just to throw up. So all living things have to respond to their environment. And the final one is heat. So, that's a similar thing to temperature. So if we look at this and we compare it to abiotic factors, right, like rocks, the rock won't respond if you kick it. It'll just move because obviously you kicked it, but it's not going to like curl up or try to run away or anything like that. This is one of the things that separate biotic and abiotic factors. So this is an example where a plant, its leaves and stems will grow toward the light because it's responding to its environment. Because the sun is, shining down on the plant wants to get as much sunlight as possible, so it'll grow towards the sun. So our 40-minute thing is going to come to an end. So if you guys could just log off and then log back on, because we have like a few more slides, so it'll probably be like another 10 minutes. So just log off and log back on, and then we'll continue. Okay, so everybody's joining back in. So we'll continue where we left off. Oh, annotations. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so all living things will grow and develop. So the difference between growth and development is that growth just means to get bigger in size. So for example, in the picture, the baby elephant will eventually grow one day and will become the same size as his parents. Development is a change in the physical form or the physiological makeup of an organism. So for example, as we grow older, our brains, they don't change in size, but, they do change in the makeup because like the neurons, they'll form different circuits and they'll form different connections, which, will change throughout our life. And because of this is what we call development, or the change in the physiological makeup of who we are. And then all living things adapt to their environment through evolution. So an adaptation is just a process that enables organisms to become better suited to their environment. So species obtain adaptations through evolution over extremely long periods of time. So for example, humans originally, were chimpanzees, or our closest ancestor is chimpanzees. And from that, we used to be monkeys. We used to be swinging in trees and things like that. But it soon became that the trees were being fully taken up. There was pretty much like very little space left on the trees, but on the ground was completely open. So eventually some monkeys started to venture onto the ground and started to walk. And then this developed over hundreds of thousands of years, and eventually we became who we are today because of these original monkeys that decided to walk onto the ground. So on the right, you see like a map of all of time. And so it's divided into eras, periods, and epochs. So an era is just a very, very large period of time. So here you can see the Cenozoic, Mesozoic, and Paleozoic. And just to give you an extent of like what this is actually showing. So the Precambrian era at the bottom in the orange is actually when there was very, very little life. The majority of the life lived in the ocean. There was nothing, there's not much on land, maybe a few insects here and there. And so then what happened in the Paleozoic era at the beginning was the Cambrian explosion, as they call it, which is an explosion of plant life all throughout land. Then at the end of the Paleozoic era, you got the Permian extinction, which was all of these organisms, like 50% of the organisms, I think, on land died out, and like another 50% died in the sea. And that actually gave way for the dinosaurs. to, rise. And that was the Mesozoic era. Then 65 million years ago, they had their extinction. And then that gave rise to the Cenozoic era, which pretty much allowed for us to, start living. So an example of an adaptation is a cactus, right? So these desert plants have very succulent and waxy leaves and stems to store water and reduce water loss. So if you actually look at the fruit of these cactuses, they're filled with water. They're really, really juicy. And this is because it can actually store the water in its fruit for the later seeds that are going to come from the fruit. And this is really important because, in the desert, these seeds are going to have no water. So it's really important that the fruit contains a lot of water. Also, fruit can be used for other organisms because, like, maybe a rabbit will come by and, pick a fruit off the cactus. And so if this fruit is filled with water, then the rabbit will really want to take it and eat it. And because of this, it'll kind of transport the seed. So it's actually a measure, the fact that its fruit is so filled with water is actually a measure for, this cactus to spread its seeds all over, the desert. So this is just one example of an adaptation in one organism. Okay, so that's the end of our presentation or our class. I will stick around for any questions. Just a few reminders that if you guys could fill out the feedback form that I'll be posting maybe an hour or like an hour or half an hour after this class, that would be great because, then I can, see what I'm doing wrong. Also, if you guys could take the pretest that I posted on Classroom, that'll be really helpful because, some of you had said you wanted like a more advanced course. So if you guys do well on that, then I can, organize that too. So, I will take this time to answer some questions. So why are two periods named Pennsylvanian and Mississippian? I really don't know why they're named that way. Maybe it could be, the governor or one of these states, bribed scientists to do so. Yes, it is cacti. I'm sorry, I said cactuses. Sorry. There's not any other questions, then I will sign off. Okay, so that's it for today's class. Feel free to email me if you, again, have any questions. Remember to fill out the form and watch the videos that I put on Classroom if you're struggling or anything like that. Okay, thank you guys for attending, and I'll see you next week on Wednesday.